Hi class, I just wanted to go over a few things relating to this week's reading on ensuring health. One huge takeaway that really wasn't emphasized in the chapter, and I really wanted to go over this and emphasize it, is the major distinction when it comes to health on a global scale between developed nations and developing nations, or even underdeveloped nations. Now, by and large, the major distinction in terms of the way in which people die or become ill, essentially we're talking about mortality and morbidity rates, relates to food. Now, food isn't the only thing. There was discussion of certain types of diseases that are necessarily related to food. The book mentioned Ebola, HIV, and malaria. But nevertheless, a lot of the problems relating to health relate to nutrition. Now, in the developed world, a lot of problems come from, I'll use this word loosely, overnutrition, though we would say it's not so much a matter of overnutrition, but receiving a lot of empty calories. On the other hand, in the developing world, the problem is undernutrition. Now, if we look at the history of Europe, during the Middle Ages and actually up until the 20th century, diseases relating to undernutrition were somewhat common in Europe. A lot of deficiency diseases. Essentially, we're talking about scurvy, lack of vitamin C, rickets, a deficiency in vitamin D, pellagra, a deficiency in niacin, or we can talk about just lack of calories. Kwashiorkor is a scientific term for literally starving to death, just not getting enough calories. Now, by and large, those diseases have gone by the wayside in the West. There's a few cases here and there in the United States and the United Kingdom. There are a few cases of scurvy that come about. Generally, it's from people who, it's not so much a matter of a lack of calories, but they have a very poor diet. They eat a lot of bread, crackers, things along those lines. They just don't get enough vitamin C, and then, usually they're treated before it becomes fatal. On the other hand, in the West and in developed nations, the problems relate to what we call chronic degenerative diseases. Those are diseases that are due to lifestyle, as well as old age. I mean, we simply have to die of something. So we're talking about diseases like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, arthritis. Okay, those are much more common here in the West, whereas in the third world we have diseases relating to lack of proper nutrition, as well as other things, not getting vaccines. There are plenty of these childhood diseases we don't hear about too much anymore in the United States and in the developed world, largely because we're immunized from them. We receive vaccines, so we're talking about diseases like polio, measles, pertussis, whooping cough. These are diseases we don't really get too much anymore. Usually when you hear about somebody getting one of those types of diseases, it's usually because they have parents who listen to, Jennifer McCarthy and believe that getting vaccines will cause autism, which that's really based on a flawed study. Now, In addition to that, there are problems in the developing world relating to hygiene and clean water. Those are major killers. And these are diseases that, by and large, due to sanitation efforts in the developed world, we don't hear too much about these diseases. Just to give you an indication of this, let's talk about some waterborne diseases. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever. Now, these are the diseases that we don't hear about in the United States, largely due to the fact that our water supply is, the microbes are killed either through chlorine or ozone. Okay, so we drink treated water. Now, there are some problems with things like chlorine, and it's probably best to get a filtered and drink filtered water, but nevertheless, you're not going to get typhoid fever when you drink the water supply in the United States. That wasn't always the case. As a matter of fact, it was 150 years ago, a long time, but not really, that when it came to soldiers dying during the United States Civil War, a very large percentage of it was not from deaths on the battlefield, but rather due to extremely poor hygiene and lack of access to clean water. So you had a lot of people dying of cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever. And it just wasn't soldiers out, on the battlefield. Just to give you an indication of this, for those of you who remember mid 20th century or mid 19th century American history, a key political figure who actually ran against Abe Lincoln in 1860 for the presidency and lost, fellow senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas. He died in 1861 of typhoid fever. So, typhoid fever is caused by drinking water that isn't properly sterilized. So, even well-to-do politicians were dropping dead of these diseases that we don't hear about in the developed world anymore. So, those are a few important concepts. Now, going back to chronic degenerative diseases, one important longitudinal study I wanted to cite, and I usually show a video on this in my regular global studies class, is a study called the China Study. So just go and Google China Study. It's done by T. Colin Campbell. Campbell was a professor at Cornell University, and he did a really interesting and thought-provoking longitudinal study in China, as the name of the study would indicate. Now, what Campbell did was he went to different regions of China and looked at health problems in those given regions. Now, this was a study done in the 1970s and 80s before China became more developed. So at that point in time, it was largely, a non-Western diet that was eaten by most of the people. Now, even though it was a non-Western diet, it was very low in animal protein and very low in dairy products. Nevertheless, there were marked differences between people's dietary habits based on region. Even though on the average people were eating significantly lower amounts of meat and dairy products, nevertheless there were certain regions in which the meat and dairy consumption was significantly higher. And what Campbell found by looking at the people in those various regions, that death rates due to cancer were significantly higher, in which the caloric intake of animal products was higher. So very stark correlation between the consumption of animal products, meat, dairy, egg, and deaths by cancer. And that was a really compelling study, and there are a lot of other studies that confirm it, though there were some criticisms made of his methodology, but nevertheless, his holdings or his findings have really stood the test of time. So the China study, look it up, do a little bit of research on it. That's a really important study. So anyway, those are a few takeaways on that. One other really important health problem, it's not one that we face here in the United States, but it is a worldwide health problem. And it's a disease that the people who are afflicted with this disease are overwhelmingly poor, and that's malaria. Now, malaria is spread by the bite of a mosquito, okay, in areas around the equator. So we're talking about in tropical areas. One problem with that, even though it's a very deadly disease, millions die each year of malaria, there hasn't been a whole lot of motivation by medical researchers to look for a cure. One of the major reasons is that this is a disease that poor people die of. Okay, these are poor people. They don't have money to spend on expensive drugs. Therefore, that incentive is not there. And to their credit, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation really looked at that problem and knew that they would have to philanthropic movements like theirs, would have to move in and fund the needed research for that disease. One of the big problems with the pharmaceutical industry, not just here in the United States, but elsewhere, is that there is that financial incentive. So, here in North America, we, for diseases, erectile dysfunction, we have, several pharmaceutical drugs to treat it, because there are a lot of, middle-aged, well-to-do men who, can pay the money for Viagra or Cialis or what have you. So that's another important consideration when we look at health from a global perspective. The fact that those diseases that are suffered, namely by poor people, are given short shrift when it comes to medical research. So anyway, just one important announcement: I'm working on the grades. Everyone's doing well in terms of the discussion, even though it's not noted on Blackboard. Another thing is I'm going to be discussing the term paper and the criteria for the term paper next week. So I'll probably have a regular lecture video as well as a video on the term paper, so make sure not to miss those. So anyway, just turn in the papers, do the discussions. You're doing well, really pleased. So just keep up doing what you're doing.